The little Apache girl was supposed to die in the desert before sunrise, but one lonely cowboy changed the fate of an entire valley. The wind carried dust across the Arizona territory like smoke drifting over old graves. Elias Turner rode alone through the dying light, his coat stiff with dirt, his horse exhausted from 14 straight miles without water. Out there, a man could disappear forever and nobody would ask where he went. That was exactly how Elias liked it. For 7 years, he had lived in silence on a forgotten stretch of land 30 miles from the nearest town. No wife, no children, no visitors except traders passing through once a month. People in Dry Creek said Elias Turner had buried too much of himself in the war to ever live like a normal man again. Maybe they were right. The sun was sinking low when his horse suddenly stopped moving. Elias frowned and tightened the reins. The animal's ears twitched toward a cluster of broken rocks half covered in red sand. Then he heard it. Breathing. Weak. Small. Human. Elias slid from the saddle slowly, boots pressing into dust that still held the heat of the day. The wind howled across the open land as he stepped around the rocks and froze. A little Apache girl sat curled against the stone, no older than 6, wrapped in torn buckskin stained with dirt and dry river mud. Her small hands clutched a broken toy horse made from carved cedar wood. One of the legs had snapped clean off. The child looked up at him with wide, dark eyes full of fear, too old for her age. Then she whispered one word. Nayeli. Her voice cracked like dry paper. Elias glanced across the empty desert. No wagons. No horses. No tracks except the tiny footprints leading nowhere. The girl's lips trembled from fever. She swayed once, then nearly collapsed sideways into the sand before Elias caught her. The heat coming off her skin startled him. She was burning alive under that cold desert wind. Easy now, he muttered quietly. The little girl flinched at first, staring at him like she expected him to disappear too. Then her tiny fingers grabbed the front of his coat and refused to let go. Elias cursed softly under his breath. Every smart instinct told him to leave her at the nearest trading post and ride away before trouble found him. Because trouble always followed fear out here. And Apache children did not wander alone unless something had gone terribly wrong. The wind shifted suddenly. Elias looked west toward the darkening hills. For just a second, he thought he saw movement far away against the ridge line. Riders. Too distant to count. His jaw tightened. The girl's breathing grew weaker against his chest. He looked down at the broken toy horse still trapped in her small hand. Then he made the kind of decision that changes a man's life forever. Elias Turner lifted the child into his arms, carried her toward his horse, and rode straight toward the one thing he had spent 7 years trying to avoid. Other people. The ranch sat alone beneath a black stretch of desert sky, hidden between dead cottonwood trees and miles of cracked earth that nobody wanted anymore. Elias Turner preferred it that way. The less the world remembered him, the easier it became to keep breathing. His horse pushed through the final half-mile slowly, exhausted hooves crunching over dry gravel, while the little Apache girl slept against his chest beneath his dust-covered coat. She barely weighed anything. That bothered him more than it should have. When Elias finally reached the barn, the lantern hanging beside the door swung gently in the cold wind. Everything looked exactly the same as it had the night before. Quiet, empty, forgotten. Yet somehow the ranch already felt different. Like trouble had crossed the fence line before he even opened the gate. Elias carried the girl inside the cabin and laid her carefully on the old leather couch beside the fire pit. Her tiny hand still refused to release the broken toy horse. Even asleep, her fingers held it tightly against her chest like the thing mattered more than food or water. Elias knelt beside the fireplace and lit the wood with slow, practiced movements. Orange light crawled across the cabin walls, touching old shelves, worn blankets, and the Winchester rifle hanging untouched above the door. The little girl stirred weakly at the warmth. Sweat glistened across her forehead. Elias grabbed a tin cup, filled it from the water barrel, and soaked a rag before placing it gently against her skin. She flinched at first, then relaxed. "You are safe now," he muttered quietly, though he was not sure whether he believed it himself. Outside, the wind scraped against the cabin walls like dry bones. Elias sat in silence watching the fire crackle while memories he spent years burying slowly climbed back into his head. He remembered another winter long ago, another frightened pair of eyes, Another moment he should have walked away and did not. That decision had nearly destroyed him. The girl suddenly whispered again in her sleep. Naeli. Elias leaned closer this time. The name carried weight. Not fear exactly. More like longing. Like the child was trying to hold on to someone disappearing in the dark. He glanced down at the carved cedar horse still trapped in her grip. One broken leg hung loose from the body. Carefully, Elias reached into a nearby drawer and pulled out his old repair kit. Thin wire. Sandpaper. A small bottle of wood glue. His rough hands moved slowly beneath the lantern light, fixing the toy piece by piece while the little girl slept beside the fire. It had probably been 15 years since he repaired anything that small. Around midnight, the child finally woke. Her dark eyes opened carefully, studying him through the flickering firelight. Fear flashed across her face when she saw the stranger sitting nearby. Elias handed her the repaired horse without speaking. The girl stared at it silently. Tiny fingers traced the fixed leg in disbelief. Then for the first time since he found her in the desert, she smiled. Small, weak, but real. And somehow that quiet little smile hit Elias Turner harder than any storm ever had. Then the horses outside suddenly began stomping in panic. Elias lifted his head toward the window. Somewhere far beyond the ranch, through the dark Arizona hills, came the faint sound of riders. The sound came again just before dawn. Hooves. Distant at first, then closer, slow enough to be controlled, fast enough to mean purpose. Elias Turner stood motionless beside the cabin window while cold blue light crept across the desert floor outside. The little girl sat wrapped in blankets near the fire, watching him silently with wide dark eyes. She had not spoken another full sentence since waking. Only names, whispers, small frightened sounds whenever the wind touched the walls too hard. Elias pushed the curtain aside slightly and scanned the horizon. Nothing yet. Just dust rolling low across the valley and the silhouettes of dead trees stretching through the morning fog. But his horses knew better. The animals shifted nervously inside the barn, snorting and stamping against the wooden floorboards. Elias had learned long ago to trust horses before men. He reached for the rifle hanging above the door, then stopped halfway. The little girl was staring at him. Not at the weapon. At his face, like she was trying to decide whether she had made a mistake trusting him. Elias slowly lowered his hand. Nobody is going to hurt you here, he said quietly. The child looked down at the repaired toy horse in her lap. Her tiny fingers brushed the smooth cedar leg he fixed during the night. Then she whispered something in Apache too softly for him to understand. What was that? Elias asked. The girl hesitated before answering in broken English. My mother says, good men fix broken things. Elias felt something tighten in his chest at those words. He looked away toward the fire before the child could notice. Outside, the wind carried the faint smell of rain even though the sky remained cloudless. Strange weather for Arizona. Strange morning altogether. Elias moved toward the stove and poured coffee into an old tin cup, while the little girl carefully slid off the couch and walked barefoot across the cabin floor. She moved slowly, still weak from fever, but stronger than the night before. Her eyes wandered across the room with quiet curiosity. Old books stacked near the fireplace, spurs hanging beside the door. A faded cavalry photograph turned face down on the shelf. Then she stopped in front of a small wooden carving sitting near the window. It was a hawk, hand-carved, worn smooth with age. The child picked it up gently. Who made this? She asked softly. Elias stared at the carving for a long moment before answering. A long time ago, someone I used to know. The girl nodded like she understood more than she should. Then suddenly, every horse outside went dead silent. Not restless, not nervous, silent. Elias slowly set down the coffee cup. That silence was worse, much worse. He stepped toward the door carefully and opened it just enough to look outside. The morning sun had finally reached the valley. Golden light spread across the dry earth and painted the desert in long shadows. And there, nearly half a mile away on the ridge above the ranch, stood riders. Dozens of them, perfectly still, watching. Elias could not make out faces yet. Only horses, dust-colored blankets, long silhouettes against the sunrise. The little girl appeared quietly beside him, clutching the toy horse against her chest. The moment she saw the riders, her breathing caught. Then she whispered the same name again. Naeli. One rider at the front slowly raised a hand toward the sky. The others remained motionless behind her like stone figures carved into the mountain itself. Elias narrowed his eyes. No rifles raised. No movement toward the ranch. Just waiting. Then something sharp suddenly struck the fence post beside the barn with a hard crack. Elias stepped forward instantly. An arrow. Long black feathers tied near the end. Not a threat. A warning. And somewhere far beyond the hills behind the ranch came another sound drifting through the morning wind. More riders. Riding hard. The riders on the ridge did not move for nearly 5 minutes. They simply watched the ranch in complete silence while the morning wind carried dust through the valley floor. Elias Turner had seen armed men before. Soldiers. Drifters. Outlaws pretending to be ranchers. But this felt different. Dangerous in a quieter way. The little Apache girl stood beside him clutching the repaired toy horse against her chest, while her dark eyes remained fixed on the woman at the front of the riders. Even from half a mile away, Elias could feel something commanding about her posture. Straight-backed. Calm. Like the desert itself had taught her patience. Then the second group of riders appeared behind the eastern hills. These men rode nothing like the Apache scouts. Fast. Sloppy. Hungry. Dust exploded beneath their horses as they pushed hard toward the valley. Elias narrowed his eyes. White men. 4 of them. Maybe 5. Long rifles tied beside their saddles. The Apache riders on the ridge noticed them too. The woman at the front slowly lowered her raised hand. Instantly, every rider behind her shifted position without a single spoken word. Elias felt the little girl tense beside him. Inside, he said quietly. She shook her head immediately. No, kid, now is not the time. No, she repeated, more firmly this time. Mother comes. Elias looked down at her. Fever still flushed her cheeks, but fear had changed into something else now. Trust. The child truly believed those riders had come for her. Before Elias could answer, the sound of galloping horses thundered across the valley. The second group arrived fast, sliding to a stop nearly 40 yards from the ranch fence. Their leader was a thick-bearded man with sunburned skin and silver rings on both hands. His eyes locked immediately onto the little girl beside Elias. Then he smiled. Not kindly, like someone spotting money laying on the ground. Well now, the man called out loudly. Looks like the reward posters were telling the truth after all. Elias said nothing. The little girl stepped slightly behind him. The man noticed. That child belongs to us, he continued. Her mother stole something valuable from some very important people. Elias glanced toward the Apache riders still standing silent on the ridge. None of them had moved closer, but somehow their stillness felt heavier now. Watching, measuring, waiting. Funny thing, the bearded man said, climbing down from his horse. We spent 3 days tracking that little girl through canyon country. Nearly lost her twice in the storm. Then some lonely rancher picks her up like a stray dog. He stopped smiling. Hand her over. Elias rested one hand near the porch rail. Not threatening. Just ready. She does not seem eager to go with you, he said calmly. One of the men laughed under his breath. That Apache woman filled her head with stories, another muttered. The mother is dangerous. At the mention of her mother, the little girl suddenly stepped forward beside Elias. Tiny fingers gripping the repaired toy horse. You lie, she whispered. The men exchanged amused looks. But the leader's expression darkened slightly. Kid, he said coldly, you do not know what your mother really is. Before Elias could respond, movement finally came from the ridge above. The woman at the front of the Apache riders began descending slowly toward the ranch alone. No weapon raised. No fear in her face. Just calm certainty. Long black hair moved softly behind her in the wind while sunlight touched the turquoise pendant resting against her chest. Every horse in the valley seemed to quiet as she approached. Elias felt something strange settle over the ranch then. Like the land itself knew her name before he did. The little girl's eyes filled instantly with tears. Nayeli, she whispered again. And this time Elias finally understood. That was not just a name. It was the woman every man in this valley seemed afraid of. The woman reached the ranch just as the wind began shifting east across the valley. Elias Turner had expected anger when he finally saw her face up close. Maybe fear. Maybe grief. Instead, the Apache woman carried herself with the kind of calm that made loud men lower their voices without understanding why. She could not have been older than 23. Sun-warmed copper-brown skin. Long black hair braided loosely with strands moving in the wind. dark eyes sharp enough to notice everything around her at once. Dust covered the hem of her leather dress from hard riding through canyon country, yet somehow she still looked untouched by exhaustion. The little girl beside Elias suddenly ran forward. "Mother!" Nayeli dropped to one knee instantly and wrapped both arms around the child so tightly Elias could hear the girl crying against her shoulder. For a few seconds, nobody in the valley moved. Even the bounty hunters stayed quiet. The woman pressed her forehead gently against her daughter's hair and closed her eyes like she was thanking heaven itself for one more breath. Then the little girl held up the repaired toy horse. "He fixed it," she whispered proudly. Nayeli looked at the toy, then slowly up at Elias. Something unreadable passed across her face. Surprise maybe, or confusion, as though kindness was the last thing she expected to find here. The bearded bounty hunter broke the silence first. "Touching reunion," he muttered, stepping closer to the fence. "Now hand over the girl, and maybe everybody rides away peaceful today." Elias noticed every Apache rider on the ridge straightened slightly at those words. Nayeli rose slowly to her feet without taking her eyes off the man. "You crossed Apache land hunting a child," she said calmly. Her English was soft but steady. "There is nothing peaceful about that." The man gave a dry laugh. "Lady, your people stole something that does not belong to you." Nayeli did not answer immediately. She simply looked toward Elias for one brief moment before turning back to the bounty hunter. "Tell him," she said quietly. The little girl clung tighter to the toy horse. "They came to our village at night," she whispered nervously. "Grandfather hid me and mother near the canyon." The child's voice shook harder now. "They wanted the map." The bounty hunters exchanged quick looks. Elias caught it instantly. Too quick. Too nervous. The bearded man forced a smile that did not reach his eyes. "Careful what stories you repeat, kid." But Elias had already begun noticing details he missed before. The men carried expensive saddles. Clean boots despite riding through storm country. One horse wore a railroad brand from New Mexico territory. These were not simple trackers chasing reward money. Somebody important had sent them. Nayeli slowly removed the turquoise pendant from around her neck and crouched beside her daughter again. "Kiona," she whispered gently, "give me the horse." The little girl hesitated before obeying. Nayeli turned the carved cedar horse over in her hands carefully. Elias frowned slightly. One side of the carving looked newer than the rest. The repaired leg. Nayeli pressed her thumb gently beneath the wooden saddle. A tiny folded piece of paper slipped loose from inside the toy horse and landed softly in her palm. Every bounty hunter went pale. Elias felt the entire valley change in one heartbeat. So that was it. Not gold. Not revenge. Not some old tribal feud. They had hunted a little girl across 40 miles of desert for whatever was written on that tiny folded paper. The bearded man's calm expression disappeared completely. "You have no idea what you are carrying," he said quietly. Nayeli stood again, eyes colder now than the desert wind. "No," she answered softly. "But you do." Then, for the first time since arriving at the ranch, every Apache rider on the ridge began moving down toward the valley together. The valley grew so quiet that Elias Turner could hear leather creaking against saddles as the Apache riders descended toward the ranch. Dust rolled beneath their horses and slow waves touched gold by the morning sun. No shouting. No panic. Just silence heavy enough to make the bounty hunters glance nervously at one another. Nayeli folded the small paper carefully and slipped it inside her pendant before turning toward Elias again. "You should not be standing here," she said softly. "Neither should you," Elias answered. For the first time, something close to a smile touched the corner of her mouth. Small, gone almost instantly, but real. The bearded bounty hunter stepped forward again, this time with less confidence than before. "Listen carefully," he said, forcing calm into his voice. "You do not understand what is happening. That paper belongs to the Redstone Railroad Company. It marks land purchased legally by the government." One of the Apache riders behind Nayeli gave a quiet laugh under his breath. Not mocking. Tired. Like he had heard too many lies over too many years. Nayeli looked toward the valley horizon where the railroad smoke trails barely touched the distant sky. "Your railroad men came with contracts after soldiers came with rifles," she said evenly. "They called both of them peace." Elias watched the bounty hunters carefully now. Sweat glistened beneath the beard on their leader's face despite the cool desert morning. Whatever was hidden on that paper mattered more than money alone. What is on the map? Elias finally asked. Naeli hesitated. The little girl beside her lowered her eyes. Immediately, like even hearing the answer might be dangerous. Water, Naeli said quietly. Enough to change this territory forever. Elias frowned slightly. Water meant cattle, farms, railroads, entire towns. In Arizona territory, water was worth more than silver half the time. Suddenly, the desperation in those men made perfect sense. The bearded hunter took another step forward. That spring belongs to the railroad now. Naeli looked directly at him. It belonged to Apache families before your country even had a name. The man's jaw tightened. Lady, you are standing in the way of progress. Elias almost laughed at that word. Progress. Men used it whenever they wanted something that already belonged to somebody else. Kiona suddenly tugged gently on Elias's sleeve. Mother walked 3 days carrying me, she whispered. She did not sleep. Elias glanced at Naeli, then noticed it for the first time. The exhaustion hidden beneath her calm face. Dust caked along her boots. Tiny cracks in her lips from dehydration. One sleeve darker near the shoulder where dried blood had soaked through earlier. She had been running hard for a long time. Yet somehow she still stood straighter than every armed man in the valley. Elias looked toward the riders now gathering near the ranch fence. Men and women both. Apache scouts carrying no expressions at all. They were not there for war. They were there for her. That realization settled heavily inside him. The little girl leaned sleepily against Naeli's side. Fever still lingered in her eyes despite the morning air. Without thinking, Elias spoke. The child needs rest. Every head turned toward him. Even the bounty hunters seemed surprised he had spoken at all. Naeli studied him carefully. You would still help us? She asked quietly. Elias looked out across the valley. One side wanted land. The other wanted survival. And somehow his lonely little ranch sat directly between both of them now. He should have hated that. Instead, he found himself staring at the exhausted mother holding her child beneath the desert sun. I have coffee, he muttered after a long silence. One of the Apache riders blinked in confusion. Another smiled, faintly beneath his scarf. Even Naeli seemed caught off guard for half a second. Then Kiona tugged her mother's hand excitedly. He fixes broken things, the little girl whispered proudly. And for reasons Elias Turner could not explain, those words hit harder than the sound of all those riders combined. By noon, the lonely ranch no longer felt lonely at all. Horses filled the valley floor in scattered lines while the dry Arizona wind carried the smell of leather, coffee, dust, and rain that still refused to fall. Elias Turner had not shared a meal with more than 2 people at once in nearly 7 years. Now Apache riders sat quietly near his barn drinking coffee from tin cups, while his horses watched them with nervous eyes. Strange world. Stranger morning. The bounty hunters remained near the outer fence beneath the hard desert sun, growing more impatient every hour. They no longer acted confident. Men stopped acting confident when they realized they were outnumbered by people who did not need to raise their voices to hold power. Elias stood beside the water trough repairing a loose saddle strap when Naeli approached him alone. Kiona slept inside the cabin wrapped in old blankets beside the fireplace, finally free from fever after eating real food for the first time in days. Naeli rested one hand against the fence rail, watching the valley in silence before speaking. You live far from everyone. Elias kept working on the strap. That is usually the idea. Most men do not choose isolation. Most men talk too much. That earned the faintest breath of amusement from her. Not laughter exactly, just enough to soften the sharpness around her eyes for a moment. Elias noticed then how tired she truly looked beneath all that calm. The kind of exhaustion that reached deeper than sleep. You should rest, he said quietly. Your riders can keep watch. Naeli shook her head slowly. If I sleep, they may find us first. Elias glanced toward the bounty hunters near the fence. Those men. No, her answer came too quickly, too seriously. Elias stopped working. The wind shifted again, carrying distant thunder from somewhere beyond the mountains. Then who? Naeli remained silent long enough for the question to become uncomfortable. Finally, she looked toward the cabin window where Kiona slept. There are men behind those hunters, she said softly. Railroad men, politicians, investors from the east. They want the spring because entire towns can grow around it. Elias understood that much already. Then sell the land. Naeli looked at him, then with an expression so sad it almost felt older than the desert itself. The spring is where Apache families buried their dead for generations. Elias said nothing after that. There was nothing useful to say. The sound of a harmonica drifted suddenly across the ranch. One of the older Apache riders sat beneath a cottonwood tree playing a slow, mournful tune, while another rider repaired horse tack nearby. The music floated gently through the valley like smoke from an old memory. Kiona appeared quietly in the cabin doorway, rubbing sleep from her eyes. The moment she spotted her mother outside, she ran across the dirt barefoot and wrapped both arms around Naeli's waist. Naeli knelt immediately and held her close. Elias looked away toward the horizon, pretending not to notice the relief on both their faces. The little girl suddenly held up the carved cedar horse again. "Mother," she whispered proudly, "he saved this too." Naeli took the toy carefully into her hands. Her fingers brushed across the repaired leg before she looked back at Elias. "Why did you help her?" she asked softly. Simple question. Hard answer. Elias stared out across the endless Arizona desert while dust rolled beneath the afternoon sun. He could have lied, could have said it was nothing, but something about the way she watched him made lying feel cheap. "Because nobody came when my family needed help," he said quietly. The valley went still after that. Even the harmonica stopped. Naeli studied him differently now. Not as a stranger. Not even as a rancher caught in the wrong place. More like a man carrying ghosts he never learned how to bury. Then one of the Apache scouts suddenly rode hard down from the northern ridge. Fast. Urgent. His horse covered ground in long, violent strides before sliding to a stop beside Naeli. The scout spoke rapidly in Apache. Elias did not understand the words. He did not need to. The fear in every rider's face said enough. Naeli slowly rose to her feet. "They found the spring," she whispered. And for the first time since arriving at the ranch, genuine fear entered her eyes. The atmosphere around the ranch changed before anybody spoke another word. Elias Turner could feel it in the horses first. The animals shifted nervously beneath the gathering clouds while the warm Arizona wind turned strangely cold across the valley floor. The Apache scout remained beside Naeli's horse, breathing hard from the ride, dust coating his shoulders and hair. Whatever he had seen near the spring had frightened him enough to ride without rest. Naeli placed one hand gently on Kiona's shoulder before speaking quietly in Apache to the riders gathered near the barn. Instantly, the relaxed silence vanished. Men reached for reins. Saddlebags tightened. Scouts moved toward higher ground around the ranch without needing instructions twice. Elias watched all of it carefully while leaning against the fence rail. "How many?" he finally asked. Naeli turned toward him slowly. "Too many." Not the answer he wanted, but honest. The bounty hunters near the outer fence had gone unusually quiet too. The bearded leader no longer looked angry. He looked nervous, like a man realizing he had stumbled into a storm much larger than himself. "You knew this would happen," Elias said. The man rubbed sweat from his neck beneath the afternoon heat. "Railroad men do not lose land deals quietly." One of the Apache riders spat into the dirt beside his horse. "They call thieves businessmen now." Elias ignored the comment and kept his eyes on Naeli instead. "What exactly did your scout see?" Naeli hesitated. Then she pulled the folded paper from inside her pendant and handed it to Elias for the first time. "See for yourself." Elias unfolded the fragile paper carefully beneath the sunlight. Most of it showed rough canyon sketches and water paths marked through northern Arizona territory. But near the bottom sat something else. Signatures, government seals, railroad contracts, and one sentence, underlined heavily in black ink. Relocation authorized immediately upon confirmation of spring access. Elias frowned deeply. He had seen enough military paperwork during the war to understand exactly what those words meant. Entire Apache families would be forced off the land the moment railroad crews arrived. Kiona watched him quietly while clutching the cedar toy horse against her chest. "Grandfather said the spring belongs to everyone," she whispered softly. "Not men who buy paper." Elias slowly folded the map again. Somewhere behind the clouds, thunder rolled low across the desert. "How long before they arrive?" he asked. Naeli looked toward the northern hills. By nightfall, silence settled heavily around the ranch after that. Even the bounty hunters avoided eye contact now. The older Apache rider with the harmonica tucked the instrument quietly into his coat and stood beside his horse. Nobody talked about fighting. Nobody talked about running either. The valley had entered that dangerous kind of calm where everybody already knew the next hours would change something forever. Elias looked toward his cabin. Small, weathered, forgotten by most of the world. He had spent 7 years building a life where nothing mattered except surviving one more winter alone. Now the place stood directly between railroad men, bounty hunters, Apache riders, and a hidden spring powerful enough to redraw maps. Strange thing was, he no longer wanted to walk away from it. Kiona suddenly stepped closer and tugged gently on his sleeve again. "Will they burn our trees?" she asked quietly. Elias looked down at her. Children asked questions in ways adults never could. Straight to the heart of things. He glanced toward Nayeli. The woman did not answer for her daughter. Perhaps she could not. Finally, Elias crouched slowly until he was eye level with the little girl. "Not while I am standing here," he said calmly. Kiona studied his face carefully before nodding once like she believed him completely. That trust hit harder than it should have. Nayeli saw it too. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then distant sounds drifted through the valley wind. Metal, wheels, heavy movement far beyond the ridge. Elias slowly rose to his feet and looked north. A thin line of black smoke had appeared against the horizon. Railroad engines. By late afternoon, the sky above Arizona territory had turned the color of old iron. Heavy clouds rolled slowly over the desert, while distant railroad smoke thickened near the northern ridge. Elias Turner stood beside the corral fence watching dark shapes move far across the horizon. Wagons, riders, supply carts, too organized to be random travelers. The railroad company was coming exactly as Nayeli feared. Around the ranch, Apache scouts moved with quiet purpose through the gathering wind. Some watered horses. Others checked the hills through old spyglasses worn smooth with age. Nobody panicked. That almost made it worse. Men only moved that calmly when they already understood how serious the situation had become. Kiona sat on the cabin porch wrapped in one of Elias's old blankets while the repaired cedar horse rested in her lap. She had barely let the toy leave her hands all day. Every few minutes her eyes searched the horizon nervously before drifting back toward her mother. Nayeli stood near the water trough speaking quietly with the older Apache rider who carried the harmonica. Elias noticed something then. The other riders listened when she spoke. Not because she demanded it, because they trusted her. Trust like that could not be forced. It had to be earned over years. The bearded bounty hunter finally approached Elias again just before sunset. The man looked exhausted now, like the weight of his own choices had finally started settling onto his shoulders. "You still have time to walk away from this," he muttered quietly. Elias kept his eyes on the horizon. "Do I? Those railroad men are not coming for conversation." Elias almost smiled at that. "Neither were you." The bounty hunter rubbed his face slowly. "We were hired to retrieve the map. That was all." "And the child?" The man looked away. That answer told Elias everything. A hard silence settled between them while the wind carried distant thunder across the valley. Finally, the bounty hunter spoke again. "You do not understand who owns this territory now." Elias glanced toward the railroad smoke drifting through the hills. "That seems to be the problem." Before the man could answer, Kiona suddenly stood from the porch. "Mother," she whispered nervously. Nayeli turned instantly. So did every Apache rider near the barn. Elias followed the little girl's frightened stare toward the northern ridge. More riders had appeared there. Not scouts this time. Railroad guards. Nearly 20 of them moving in a long line beside 2 black wagons. Men wearing dark coats and carrying polished rifles across their saddles. Behind them rolled a heavy steam wagon dragging railroad equipment through the dust. The sound alone felt wrong in the quiet valley. Mechanical. Cold. Like the future arriving without asking permission. One of the Apache horses reared nervously at the noise. Nayeli walked slowly toward Elias until they stood side by side, facing the approaching line together. "Once they build tracks near the spring," she said softly, "everything changes." Elias looked across the land surrounding his ranch. Dry grass bending beneath the storm wind. Cottonwood trees creaking softly near the creek bed. Empty miles that somehow no longer felt empty at all. "Maybe everything already has," he answered quietly. Nayeli studied him for a moment beneath the darkening sky. Most men would protect themselves first. Elias rested one hand against the fence rail worn smooth by years of loneliness. Most men have something left worth protecting. For the first time since arriving at the ranch, Naeli looked at him not with caution or gratitude. Something gentler than that. Something careful. Then the steam wagon let out a long metallic whistle that echoed across the valley like a warning from another world. Kiona flinched instantly and grabbed tighter onto the cedar horse. The Apache riders mounted their horses one by one. The railroad men kept coming. And somewhere deep inside himself, Elias Turner realized the lonely life he buried himself in 7 years ago was already gone forever. The railroad men reached the valley just as the first drops of rain began falling onto the dry Arizona earth. Slow drops at first, heavy enough to darken the dust. Around the ranch porch, Elias Turner stood near the corral gate watching the line of wagons roll closer beneath the storm clouds, while every instinct inside him whispered that nothing good ever arrived wrapped in money and polished boots. The steam wagon hissed loudly as it stopped nearly 60 yards from the ranch fence. Horses snorted uneasily at the strange machine, while armed guards spread out beside the wagons with careful discipline. These were not drifters or bounty hunters. These men worked for companies rich enough to buy sheriffs and governors. One rider finally stepped forward from the group, older than the others. Gray suit despite the desert heat, black gloves untouched by dirt. He carried himself like a man who had spent his life giving orders from behind polished desks instead of surviving storms. His horse stopped calmly near the fence line, while rain tapped softly against his hat brim. "I assume one of you is Elias Turner," the man called out evenly. Elias did not move. "Depends who is asking." The man removed one glove finger by finger with slow, deliberate calm. "Samuel Whitaker, Redstone Railroad Company." Elias heard one of the Apache riders curse quietly under his breath. Even Naeli's expression hardened at the name. Whitaker glanced briefly toward her before returning his attention to Elias. "You have found yourself caught in a very unfortunate misunderstanding, Mr. Turner." "Looks expensive for a misunderstanding." A faint smile touched Whitaker's face. "Everything worth having usually is." Thunder rolled low across the valley while the rain slowly strengthened. Kiona stood beside her mother beneath the ranch porch, holding the cedar horse tightly against her chest. Whitaker noticed the toy immediately. His eyes narrowed almost invisibly. "There is property belonging to my company currently in your possession," he continued calmly. "A map," Elias answered. Whitaker nodded once. "A legal survey document identifying future railroad expansion routes and underground water access." Naeli stepped forward then, rain catching in her dark hair. "That spring belongs to Apache families." Whitaker finally looked directly at her. Not cruelly. Worse than that. Like a businessman discussing numbers on paper. "Miss Naeli, the federal government disagrees. The federal government has never buried children beside that water." Silence followed her words. Even some railroad guards looked uncomfortable after hearing them. Whitaker sighed softly, almost tired. "This territory is changing whether any of us approve or not. Towns will come. Farms. Schools. Churches. Civilization." Elias glanced toward the steam wagon belching black smoke into the storm sky. "Funny thing about civilization," he muttered quietly. "It usually arrives carrying guns." One of the railroad guards shifted awkwardly beside his horse. Whitaker ignored the comment completely. "I did not come here looking for conflict," he said. "I came to offer terms." He slowly removed a folded document from inside his coat and held it toward Elias across the rain. "Sign this, and your ranch becomes part of Redstone territory. We compensate you generously. The Apache riders leave peacefully. Nobody loses anything further." Elias stared at the paper without taking it. Rainwater slid from the brim of his hat, while thunder cracked somewhere beyond the northern hills. "And if I do not sign?" Whitaker's expression barely changed. "Then the railroad proceeds regardless." Kiona suddenly stepped forward beside Naeli despite the rain. Small, barefoot, wrapped in one of Elias's blankets. She looked directly at Whitaker with eyes too brave for a child her age. "You cannot buy rivers," she whispered softly. Something strange happened then. One of the railroad guards lowered his gaze toward the ground. Then another. Tiny reactions. Human reactions. Whitaker noticed too. His jaw tightened slightly for the first time. Elias looked around the valley slowly. Apache riders soaked beneath the storm. Railroad men standing stiff beside machines. A frightened child clutching a repaired toy horse. And somewhere in the middle of all of it stood one lonely rancher who had spent years pretending the world no longer mattered to him. The rain fell harder. Elias finally looked Whitaker directly in the eye. "I think you should leave my land." And for the very first time since arriving at the ranch, Samuel Whitaker stopped looking completely certain of himself. Rain poured harder across the valley after Elias Turner spoke those words. Cold water rolled from hat brims, saddle leather, wagon wheels, and the weathered roof of the lonely ranch, while thunder echoed across the Arizona hills like distant cannon fire from another lifetime. Nobody moved at first. Samuel Whitaker remained seated on his horse, staring at Elias through the storm with the calm expression of a man unused to hearing the word no. Behind him, railroad guards shifted uneasily beside the steaming black machine, hissing smoke into the dark sky. Across the ranch yard, Apache riders sat mounted and silent beneath the rain, watching everything with the stillness of wolves waiting for the wind to change. Then Whitaker slowly folded the unsigned contract and slipped it back inside his coat. "You are making a costly mistake," he said evenly. Elias rested one hand against the wet fence rail. "Would not be my first." One of the railroad guards gave the smallest smile before quickly hiding it. Whitaker noticed. His face hardened slightly. "Mr. Turner," he continued, "men like you survive by understanding when history cannot be stopped." Elias glanced toward the steam wagon chewing smoke into the storm clouds. "Funny thing about history," he muttered. "Usually gets written by men standing far away from the mud." Nayeli looked at him differently after that. Not with surprise anymore. With understanding. Like she finally recognized the kind of loneliness living inside him. Kiona suddenly stepped away from her mother and walked slowly into the rain toward Elias. Tiny boots splashing through muddy water. Every adult in the valley watched her. The little girl reached up carefully and slipped her small hand into Elias's rough, weathered palm. Such a small thing. Yet somehow it changed the feeling of the entire ranch. Whitaker stared at the child for a long moment before speaking again. "You truly intend to stand between a railroad company and federal expansion?" Elias looked down at Kiona, holding his hand like she had known him her whole life. Then he looked toward Nayeli standing beneath the storm, with rain running across her copper-brown skin and dark hair. A mother who had crossed deserts carrying her child instead of surrendering her future. Finally, Elias faced Whitaker again. "No," he said quietly. "I think your company placed itself between people trying to survive." The thunder cracked louder this time. Horses shifted nervously. One of the bounty hunters slowly removed his hat and stepped away from the railroad men altogether. "This was never supposed to involve children," he muttered softly. Another guard lowered his rifle toward the mud. Then another. Small moments. Quiet moments. But Whitaker saw them all. The control he carried into the valley was slipping one man at a time. His jaw tightened beneath the rain. "You all believe this ends with emotion," he said coldly. "But the railroad always comes eventually." Nayeli finally stepped forward through the storm until she stood beside Elias and Kiona. "Maybe," she answered softly. "But not today." The Apache riders behind her slowly removed their hats one by one beneath the rain. Not for battle. For respect. Elias frowned slightly, confused at first. Then the older Apache rider with the harmonica dismounted completely and placed one hand across his chest while facing Elias. Another rider followed. Then another. One by one, every Apache rider in the valley stepped down from their horses in silence before lowering their heads toward the lonely rancher standing in the rain beside the child he saved. Elias looked at Nayeli in disbelief. "What are they doing?" he asked quietly. Nayeli's eyes softened despite the storm. "Honoring the man who protected my daughter when nobody else would." The rain continued falling across the valley while every Apache rider stood motionless beneath the dark sky. No cheers. No speeches. Just silence heavy with gratitude. Even the railroad guards looked shaken by it. Elias Turner had spent 7 years believing he was a man the world forgot. Yet somehow, on a storm-soaked ranch in the middle of nowhere, an entire valley stood still because of one small act of kindness. The storm began fading just before sunset. Rainwater dripped from the ranch roof in slow, steady rhythms, while gray clouds pulled apart above the Arizona valley, allowing streaks of golden light to spill across the wet earth. Nobody spoke for a long time after the Apache riders honored Elias Turner in the rain. Even Samuel Whitaker remained silent beside his horse, watching something he clearly did not understand. Respect like that could not be bought with railroad money or government papers. It had to be earned. Slowly, quietly, one human being at a time. Kiona still held tightly to Elias's hand while the little cedar horse rested beneath her arm. Mud covered the hem of her blanket now, but for the first time since arriving at the ranch, she no longer looked frightened. She looked safe. Naeli noticed it too. The look in a mother's eyes when her child finally breathes easy again after days of fear. Elias glanced toward the horizon where the railroad wagons stood motionless beneath fading light. "You should leave before dark," he told Whitaker calmly. The railroad man removed his gloves slowly, studying Elias with careful frustration. "You believe this changes anything?" he asked quietly. Elias looked across the valley. Apache riders tending horses beside railroad guards who no longer seemed eager to fight anyone. The bounty hunters standing apart from everybody else with shame written across their tired faces. Kiona laughing softly as rain dripped from the brim of Elias's hat onto her nose. Strange thing was, it already had changed something. Whitaker finally looked toward Naeli. "You truly think you can stop progress forever?" Naeli stepped beside her daughter and rested one hand gently against Kiona's shoulder. "No," she answered softly. "But maybe progress should learn how to ask permission first." One of the railroad guards lowered his eyes after hearing that. Another quietly removed the company badge from his coat pocket and slipped it away. Tiny moments again. Human moments. Whitaker noticed every one of them. The control he arrived with had vanished completely now. Thunder rumbled far away beyond the mountains as evening settled across the ranch. Finally, Whitaker climbed back onto his horse. "This territory will not stay untouched forever," he warned. Quietly, Elias nodded once. "Nothing does." For a second, the older man almost looked tired instead of powerful. Then he turned his horse toward the wagons without another word. One by one, the railroad guards followed him back toward the ridge while steam hissed from the heavy machine fading into the distance. The bounty hunters left next. None of them looked proud riding away through the mud. The bearded leader paused only once beside Elias. "I was wrong about you," he muttered quietly. Elias shrugged faintly. "Most people are." By nightfall, only the Apache riders remained near the ranch beneath a sky slowly filling with stars. Fires crackled softly beside the cottonwood trees while horses rested peacefully at last. The valley no longer felt trapped between worlds. Just quiet again. Honest quiet. Kiona sat beside Elias on the porch steps, swinging her legs, while Naeli brewed coffee over the fire nearby. The little girl suddenly leaned against Elias's shoulder without warning. Natural as breathing. Elias froze for half a second like a man unfamiliar with kindness touching his life. Then slowly, awkwardly, he relaxed. Naeli watched from beside the firelight. Warm golden light touched her face while wind moved softly through her long dark hair. "My daughter trusts very few people," she said quietly. Elias stared out across the dark valley. "Smart kid." A faint smile crossed Naeli's face again. This time it stayed longer. Kiona looked down at the repaired cedar horse in her lap before whispering sleepily. "Grandfather used to say some people carry water, and some people become water." Elias frowned slightly. "What does that mean?" The little girl yawned against his shoulder. "Water gives life to everyone around it." Silence settled softly after that. Elias looked toward Naeli across the firelight. She held his gaze for a long moment without speaking. No promises. No grand speeches. Just two tired souls sitting beneath desert stars, while a little girl slept peacefully between them. And for the first time in 7 years, Elias Turner no longer felt like a man waiting quietly for the world to forget him. Morning arrived quietly over the Arizona Valley. Thin, golden sunlight spread across wet grass and drifting fog while the last traces of the storm disappeared beyond the mountains. For the first time in days, the air smelled clean. Fresh rain. Horses. Wood smoke rising slowly from the ranch chimney. Elias Turner stepped onto the porch carrying 2 tin cups of coffee and stopped for a moment at the sight before him. Apache riders moved calmly through the morning light preparing their horses for departure, while Kiona chased a pair of chickens through the muddy yard laughing hard enough to make the horses nervous. The sound caught Elias off guard. Children laughing did not belong in places like this anymore. Not after everything the frontier had become. Yet there it was anyway. Real. Alive. Nayeli stood near the corral tightening supplies onto her saddle while sunlight touched the turquoise pendant resting against her chest. She looked less exhausted now, still weary, still carrying the weight of too many hard roads, but lighter somehow, like the valley itself had finally allowed her to breathe. Elias walked toward her and held out one of the coffee cups. "You ride out early," he said quietly. Nayeli accepted the cup carefully. Their fingers brushed for half a second in the cold morning air. "The spring still needs protecting," she answered. Elias nodded once. He understood. Some places were too sacred to leave unguarded. Kiona suddenly ran toward them, holding the repaired cedar horse high above her head. "Look," she shouted proudly. "He can stand now." Elias glanced at the toy horse balanced perfectly on all four legs. Something about that small image stayed with him. Broken things standing again. Maybe that was all anybody on the frontier was truly trying to do. The older Apache rider with the harmonica approached slowly beside his horse. He studied Elias for a long moment before reaching into his saddlebag and removing a small leather pouch. "For the ranch," he said quietly while handing it over. Elias frowned slightly and opened the pouch. Inside rested several small Apache seeds wrapped carefully in cloth. "Cottonwood," the old rider explained. "Plant them near water." Elias looked out across the dry land surrounding his ranch. "Trees do not grow easy out here." The old rider smiled faintly beneath his weathered face. "Neither do good men." Then he mounted his horse and rode toward the others. One by one, the Apache riders began leaving the ranch beneath the golden morning sky. No speeches, no dramatic farewells, just quiet nods and respectful glances as they passed Elias by the gate. The kind of gratitude too deep for words. Finally, only Nayeli and Kiona remained. Kiona hugged Elias around the waist without warning before pressing the cedar horse into his hands. "Keep him safe until we come back," she whispered. Elias looked down at the toy in surprise. "You trust me with this?" The little girl nodded seriously. "You fix broken things." His throat tightened unexpectedly. He managed only a small nod in return. Nayeli stepped closer then, close enough for Elias to see sunlight reflected softly inside her dark eyes. "Most men would have traded us for money," she said quietly. Elias looked toward the distant railroad tracks barely visible against the horizon. "Most men are afraid to lose what they own." Nayeli studied him carefully. "And you?" Elias glanced around the ranch, the porch, the horses, the valley, then finally back at her. "I think I was afraid to care about anything again." Silence settled softly between them while morning wind moved through the cottonwood trees beside the creek bed. Then Nayeli reached up slowly and removed the turquoise pendant from around her neck. She placed it gently into Elias's rough, weathered hand. "So you remember this valley has people who still see you?" Before Elias could answer, she mounted her horse beside Kiona. The little girl waved excitedly as they rode away with the others into the endless Arizona light. Elias stood alone near the gate long after the riders disappeared beyond the hills. But the ranch no longer felt empty. He looked down at the pendant in one hand and the small cedar horse in the other, while warm wind moved softly across the land. Then, for the first time in many years, Elias Turner walked back toward his home, not like a man hiding from the world, but like a man finally ready to live inside it again.